Haven't you heard of that madman who in the bright morning lit a lantern and ran around the marketplace crying incessantly, "I'm looking for God! I'm looking for God!" Since many of those who did not believe in God were standing around together just then, he caused great laughter. "Has he been lost then?" asked one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" asked another. "Or is he hiding? Is God afraid of us? Has God gone to sea, emigrated?" Thus they shouted and laughed, one interrupting the other. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Where is God?" he cried. "I'll tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers." That's from Friedrich Nietzsche, written in The Gay Science, the revised edition in 1887. And so begins this series of online videos all about the question of, is God dead? You know, to speak of God's death is to enter into an interpretive debate, necessarily. What we'll be doing here is properly then understood as hermeneutics. It's a big fancy word that means the study of our interpretations of experiences and our experiences of interpretations. Hermeneutics can sometimes feel like you're doing history. Other times it can feel like you're doing philosophy or theology. But it's always a blend of a variety of different ways of knowing and learning. Technically, hermeneutics is the study of the impact of an observer's experiences on their interpretation of a text, of yet another experience, of a person. The kind of simple way of thinking about this is hermeneutics involves the study of a person or group's point of view. Hermeneutics is also a method of interpretation based on that very thing, one's point of view. An interpretation might involve a variety of things. One, analysis of the author's argument. Another, analysis of the author's social and historical context, as well as how that social or historical context bears on the author's actual argument. There's also a reflexive dimension to hermeneutics, and that involves analysis of that is you, the reader's, reception of the author's argument, and you guessed it, an analysis of your reception's influence from your social and historical context, that is your experiences. All of those things that make you, have a bearing on how you interpret, how you understand a text or a discourse. Not whether you're smart enough or not smart enough, but how you experience the world has an impact on how you experience other aspects of that world. In this case, that world is the text of Nietzsche's Madman. We often take for granted the concept of meaning. That is, we use the word a lot. What do you mean? What does he mean? What does she mean? What do they mean? Well, I mean to do this. I mean to do that. Meaning involves an awareness of the values we ascribe to different characters or signs or images and experiences. Understanding what meaning is crucial for making sense of God, Nietzsche, and all that follows in these lectures. So what does it mean to mean something? To mean something is to share in an experience or an awareness of shared experience with others. When I ask, what does that mean? It's always a question about, do I have experiences that enable me to share understanding of what you're describing to me? For instance, what does it mean to be an American? What does that mean? So the question of, is God alive or dead, is far more complicated than a pedantic theological debate. And so let's apply what we're talking about and thinking about with Nietzsche to the context of the nation state, to national identity. So what does it mean to be an American? Think about that question as we read more now from the Madman. But how do we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Where are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling? And backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there still even an up and down? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? Hasn't it got colder? Isn't night and more night coming again and again? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning? Do we still hear nothing of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we still smell nothing of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. The conclusion of that passage marks some of the most famous words in all of Western philosophy. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. So what does that mean? In other words, can we share in an experience? Can we telegraph our awareness of a shared experience from one to the other? Nietzsche was born in 1844. He lived until 1900. He was essentially German, but Prussian, the Prussian and German Empire. And he's reflecting on that empire when he's writing these words about God's death. Now, there are a lot of differences between the Prussian context and what will eventually become the German Empire and contemporary US politics or society. But it's worth noting that Nietzsche is absolutely interested in thinking about what it means to be German. His references, his awareness, his understanding of the question of is God alive or dead has everything to do with what he understands to be the health or the lack thereof of the German nation state, of German identity. Who are we? Who are they as Germans? So I pose the question here now, who are we as Americans? And for those who are not from America or from the United States, don't think of this as an exclusive kind of discussion. Rather, I want you to think of it as a case study. So I'm positing this as an example for us to understand what Nietzsche is doing. But it also has a bearing on how we understand the contemporary Western world in general. Nietzsche was interested in the question of whether or not the community, the society, the culture that he felt himself a part, whether or not it was healthy. And I don't know about you, but if you look in almost any direction in the Western world, there are cries and there are sorrows, there's anguish on the news every single day. There's infighting, political infighting. There's violence in the streets. There's violence in our schools. Students, children can't go to school without worrying that some tragedy will befall them. The rights of some of us seem to matter still more than the rights of all of us. And I'm not even meaning this to suggest my own politics. I'm just trying to describe the situation that we find ourselves in and draw parallels between it and the world that Nietzsche found himself in the 1880s. Nietzsche had a profound influence on many thinkers across since his writing, since the time of his death. And he's been linked to everyone from Nazis to anarchists to feminists. Some of you might think those are all the same. They're not. Many folks have suggested, though, that his works, on the one hand, helped to give birth to Nazism, but on the other hand, helped to give birth to existentialism. and what we call postmodernism in the 20th century. Now, folks who are on the right politically might think of postmodernism in a negative light, but there's no way to describe postmodernism as a form of Nazism or a form of fascism. That doesn't mean that there aren't postmodernists who act like Nazis or fascists. It just means that they're not the same thing. Postmodernism is, in a sense, the end of the notion of a singular meaning. And Nazism or fascism is, in a sense, a response to that suggestion with a charge of saying, no, there is only one meaning, and we will do anything we can in order to convince you of that meaning. Another thing to note about Nietzsche is he is a master skeptic. That's what he's remembered as. He rejects everything, whether religious and philosophical or scientific. That is, in terms of ideas, he rejects things. It could be that his social life, his social circumstances were such that his rejection of everything in terms of the ideas was in part a response to his having felt rejected in all manner of social world. You might think of Nietzsche, in fact, as what we today call an incel. That is, an involuntary celibate. In other words, he couldn't get laid. And this, we would be naive in thinking that it had no bearing on his sensibilities. And for what it's worth, he ends up dying of syphilis, probably contracted in one of the many brothels that he would patron. But this doesn't mean that he is bereft of value for us. It could be that the severity of his circumstances are instructive for us. In terms of Germany then, contemporary Germany then, he regards them as having been moving backwards. His understanding of philosophy at the time, its reliance on logical inference. He suggests in the same book where the Madman speaks, he suggests that over-reliance on logic is illogical and unjust. Furthermore, he says scientific thinking has become poisonous. The Gay Science is a book where he sets out to respond to two different extremes as he understood them. The first extreme involves the romantics that were afoot in 19th century Germany. These romantics were high idealists. That is, they didn't really care about like what was happening in or with material circumstances. They were poets, artists, believers in beauty. He said that these folks had done a lot for Germany, for Germanness. But art itself, aesthetics, that is, the stuff we make as culture, was not enough to hold us together as a German people. On the other hand, he was as equally upset by those we remember today as the logical positivists. Again, he thinks that folks have used science and logic to such an extreme that they have created a circumstance where there is no beauty, no value at all to be had. He said Germany had teetered for decades back and forth between one or two of these poles, never finding a kind of balance or middle ground. And as a result, Nietzsche was convinced that they had lost all epistemological certainty. That is, they lost all kind of certainty with respect to what they know, but they had also lost all ethical or moral certainty. They were on the verge of having no sense of right and wrong, no bearing. And the reason has everything to do with Christianity and its connection to Germanness, but more on that later. But he's worried. He's worried that the country that he loves, or the people that he loves, the culture that he loves, has become unmoored, adrift at sea. And he worries as well that they have lost all claims to aesthetic priority, is what we would call it. That is a sense of uniqueness, cultural uniqueness. What are the Germans doing that makes them special, in other words? Those are the three kind of pillars upon which the Gay Science is founded. The rest of his work, and all of his work, is, you might say, concerned with two central issues or problems. One is decadence, and the other is nihilism. Nihilism ends up the more important of the two. And here, nihilism, going back to one of the first points that I mentioned, nihilism involves the loss of meaning, the inability to understand that we share in certain experiences, finding no value in life. That's what nihilism means. He, from that, became what many have said is a moral nihilist. That is a view that nothing is intrinsically moral or immoral. Nevertheless, for him, it was important that there be some sort of agreement on that. And it seemed like for him in Germany, there wasn't an agreement. That for him was extremely problematic. Remember, I'm trying to draw parallels for you between what Nietzsche is interested in, what he's talking about, what he's referencing, and the contemporary Western moment. So this notion of decadence seems incredibly significant. You know, decadence is, decadence is civilization in decay. It's the loss of earlier greatness and the management of excesses. You can think of examples including the British Empire or the American Empire. It's like if you look around the UK or you look around parts of the United States, you see great wealth and abundance. But especially where I am right now and outside of Philadelphia, you look at Philadelphia, there are all of these magisterial buildings and things that have been constructed over the last several hundred years that are in decay. There are more things out and available to us than we have resources to take care of the upkeep on those things. That's decadence. Those very successes from yesteryear have become the undoing of the community now. That's kind of what decadence means, and this is what Nietzsche is worried about. And I think this has an important bearing on how we understand the contemporary US context, right? We've become a power that exceeds the British Empire of 100 years prior, not in terms of land, but in terms of power and influence. And we, I imagine, surely exceed the power and influence of the Roman Empire as well. But those empires are no more, particularly the Roman Empire, where infighting and fears of others, outside others, came to undermine the civic engagement, the capacities for making meaning. This is what Nietzsche is worried over. Nietzsche is responding to what he regards as the failure of the West, the Enlightenment, modernity, all of it. His underlying view was that if we don't make a drastically new start, we are doomed, since we are living in the wreckage of 2,000 and more years of fundamentally mistaken ideas about almost everything that matters, in, as it were, the decadence of what was anyway deadly. He pulls no punches. He's remembered as being an aphoristic philosopher, which is, he offers these little nuggets. He's kind of like a TikToker before TikTok in this way. Usually in philosophy, all of your ideas have to cohere with all of the other ideas you present in a text. And here they do thematically, but they don't always in a logical order. Why? Because screw that logic. That logic has not been helpful. And so he offers us short, disjointed ideas, these aphorisms that are meant to rupture, not resolve or rationalize. And this offers a way of understanding the madman. And so he continues. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water could we clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What holy games will we have to invent for ourselves? Is the magnitude of this deed not too great for us? Do we not ourselves have to become gods merely to appear worthy of it? There was never a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will on account of this deed belong to a higher history than all history up to now. Nietzsche tells us that at that point the madman fell silent and looked at his listeners. They were silent and had finally began to take him seriously. They looked at him disconcertedly. Finally, he threw his lantern on the ground so that it broke into pieces and went out. "I came too early," he then said. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." Much more can and should be discussed about the logical positivism and the romanticism that's so deeply influencing what Nietzsche is writing about here with the madman. And if you were taking my class, my actual class, I would be spending much more time on it. We would talk about it much more in our discussions. But for me, another passage in the Gay Science really distills down what it is that Nietzsche is so frustrated by when he looks at history and looks at how the Germans of that point had gotten to that point. And here he says, the greatest unity of polytheism. So this is his explanation of why God is on the hot seat for Nietzsche. He says, for the individual to set up his own ideal and derive from it his laws, his pleasures and his rights, that has perhaps been hitherto regarded as the most monstrous of all human aberrations, and as idolatry in itself. In fact, the few who have ventured to do this have always needed to apologize to themselves, usually in this way. Not I, but a God through my instrumentality. It was in the marvelous art and capacity for creating gods, in polytheism, that is, the worship, the existence of a multitude of gods, that this impulse was permitted to discharge itself. It was here that it became purified, perfected, and ennobled. So Nietzsche is upset at what he thinks Christianity has created amongst the Germans. To be German was to be from a variety of different tribes, and the thing that unified Germans as Germans historically was that they were Christians. Protestant in most cases, but Christians nonetheless. It was Luther's creation actually, of the Bible into the German language that simultaneously offered them a vernacular translation of the Bible, but it literally created the German language in that moment. It created the written German language. It became normative, and as a result, Germanness was born. So the link between what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a German is deeply interwoven. That'd be well and good, except Nietzsche has a serious problem with the monotheism that he thinks has infected Christianity. And so here he's talking instead about the perils that have befallen polytheists, but he's really championing polytheism as a better alternative. He says, for it was originally a commonplace and unimportant impulse akin to stubbornness, disobedience, and envy. To be hostile to this impulse towards the individual ideal, that was formerly the law of every morality. As he's saying, Christianity doesn't allow for individuality. Whether or not that's true is something worth discussing and thinking about. But in his case, that's what he was worried about. He goes on, there was then only one norm, the man, and every people believed that it had this one and ultimate norm. Here he's a bad historian. What he's saying is flat out not true, but that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily useful philosophically. It might not be, but you can be a bad historian and a good philosopher, and vice versa. In fact, not everyone who does one is usually good at the other. But above himself, he continues, and outside of himself, in a distant overworld, a person could see a multitude of norms. Here's where he starts to get fanciful and romantic himself in regards to how he understands polytheism. The one God was not the denial or blasphemy of the other gods. That's what we're thinking about, no matter where you fall on this. The one God was not the denial or blasphemy of the other gods. It was here that individuals were first permitted. It was here that the right of individuals was first respected. The inventing of gods, heroes, and supermen of all kinds, as well as coordinate men and undermen, dwarfs, fairies, centaurs, satyrs, demons, and devils, was the inestimable preliminary to the justification of the selfishness and sovereignty of the individual. The freedom which was granted to one God in respect to other gods was at last given to the individual himself in respect to laws, customs, and neighbors. Again, as a historian of religion, I can tell you he's being a bad historian. Polytheism did not provide all of these things that he's describing. That would be a different video altogether. Nevertheless, here comes his critique of monotheism, which is more or less on the nose. He says, monotheism, on the contrary, the rigid consequence of the doctrine of one normal human being. Consequently, the belief in a normal God, beside whom there are only false, spurious gods, has perhaps been the greatest danger of mankind in the past. Man was then threatened by that premature state of inertia, which, so far as we can see, most of the other species of animals reached long ago, as creatures who all believed in one normal animal and ideal in their species, and definitely translated their morality of custom into flesh and blood. Here again, he's no historian, he's no biologist. He's making a point about the weight of monotheism in foreclosing any possibility of variety. Here's where he falls, in the line, not the line, but kind of the intersection between something like fascism and something like postmodernism. He laments, he's scared of the loss of variety, but he doesn't really feel like he's ever truly experienced it, precisely because of his disdain, his intense, virulent disdain of monotheism's impact on Germanness. In polytheism, man's free thinking and many-sided thinking has a prototype set up. That's him. He continues, the power to create for himself new and individual eyes, always newer and more individualized, so that it is for man alone of all the animals that there are no eternal horizons and perspectives. What do you think he's saying right there? He's saying that in polytheism, each one of us gets to model ourselves in the image of a God. We're all gods. And through that, what we call projection, what we're able to do with that awareness becomes infinitely large, multivalent, pointed in every direction, creating new directions, new degrees on a compass that we can barely conceive of. Monotheism, on the other hand, for him, we all turn into the same boring, drab, homogeneous simpletons, and we suffer. The caveat to all of this, it's an important caveat, I've left it till the end because it's important, not to conceal it, is that it is impossible for us to adequately analyze Nietzsche's interpretation or our own interpretation of his content if we do not see the relationship between Nietzsche's disdain for monotheism and Nietzsche's virulent anti-Semitism. Now, this is not to say that Nietzsche is in fact responsible for Nazism, but it's absolutely the case that, like many of his counterparts of the time, he wanted to blame all of Germany's problems on the Jews. One could do worse than to kind of read between the lines and deconstruct a lot of his argument here as an attack on Jews. His attack on monotheism can absolutely be read as an attack on Jews. Now, this doesn't mean his ideas involving the problems of monotheism are bereft of usefulness, but we cannot disassociate his critique of monotheism from his critique, to put it euphemistically, of Jews. His problem, he even says this in many places, his problem with Christianity is that it's too Jewish. In other words, monotheism is Jewish, and because Christianity became monotheistic, it is causing more harm than it is good. What's interesting is his talk of the death of God here is kind of in reference to the death of society, or the death of the possibility for a society where humans are able to flourish in their variety. And on this point, he's absolutely, well, not absolutely, but he's pretty spot on with respect to the track record left by monotheistic traditions. In the history of religions, there is not a kind of religion that has been more bloodthirsty, more ruthless than the monotheistic traditions. This does not leave the burden of representation or responsibility on the shoulders of Jews. Christians and Muslims are absolutely the preeminent perpetrators of this sorts of violence, and Jews end up the victims of it over and over across for about as long as Christianity was a state-based religion. So the question is, what is the madman and what is God for the madman? Surely each of you have an interpretation. You might leave it in the comments, in fact. The other viewers of this video would love to hear other folks' thoughts about the video and about this content. As I understand it, and as I kind of suggest to my students, the madman is the person who's given up on the idea of God in a society that still believes in that God. That's one possibility. Another is the madman is the person who believes and thinks no one else believes in God. You might, as a thought experiment, just imagine your own experiences. What does it feel like when you're trying to tell the truth and no one will believe you? As it concerns so many examples in the contemporary West, what does it feel like to swear that you have an answer to a problem that would positively impact many people in your society, but nobody gives a shit? Is that not maddening? Is the madman the nihilist who doesn't know their lives are meaningless? Or is the madman Nietzsche, the one who knows life is relative, meaning is proximate, and Christianity prevents people, according to him, of course, from leading meaningful lives? I think in many respects, the idea of God being dead means that belief has stopped working for society. And I think this has bearing on how we understand the contemporary United States. It doesn't mean belief has stopped mattering for people. It just means it's not doing what it seems to have done in yesteryear. There was a kind of cohesion made possible by a certain trust in the civic body, that we all were sharing in a certain set of experiences, variable across them, but nevertheless similar. Many of us still believe in the importance of that, but that's a different thing altogether than whether or not that is still useful for us to believe. And this is what I think the madman is so maddened by. Whether Germans 130 years ago, or contemporary US citizens, or contemporary citizens of the Western globalizing society, we don't know what to do or what to think or who to trust. Not really. We have our positions, all of us, but we don't know what to do or trust or think fully. We've lost certainty, if we ever had it. It could be that God is dead. It is really a reference to an awareness that we never had that certainty to begin with. Others will need to lament this, the loss of that certainty. That's what a lot of my work has been about for years now. Specifically, contemporary white Christians, white men also, white people are in the position where we need to lament. We need to kind of process the losses that we are experiencing from the end of the version of the society that we were born into. This runs the gamut, from folks who might be on the political right who want to bring that kind of society back, all the way to folks on the left who might be aware of the problems of that kind of society. Every single one of those people need to do the work of lamenting, processing the loss associated with it, even if it's kind of counterintuitive or ironic to think that we ought lament something that wasn't good for everyone. Where in the history of the world is there an example of an idea or an experience that was good for everyone? There's not. That's a liberal lie. I mean liberal not in the political sense, but in the kind of classic Western sense. It is a lie that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better about the abundance that has now turned into decadence. And if we don't start this process of lament pretty soon, I'm afraid Nietzsche's words will be falling on deaf ears, which is, of course, maddening. So I'll let Nietzsche have the floor one last time. His Madman wraps up the soliloquy, reminding that lightning and thunder need time. The light of the stars needs time. Deeds need time, even after they are done, in order to be seen and heard. This deed is still more remote to them than the remotest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It is still recounted how on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there started singing his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Let out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, "What then are these churches now, if not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" Thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, be sure to hit like and subscribe for more videos to come. Bye for now.